up our first speaker, is the former director of the Office of Management and Budget and currently the president of the Center for Knowing America, which is a great organization. So I'll invite Mr. Russell T. Vought.
Thanks, Nick. Appreciate that welcome. It's great to be here to participate in this Statecraft series, and it's a really important topic. It's one that recent Christians have really misunderstood for far too long, and there have been grave implications as a result of that. It's led to terrible public policy that impacts our communities. It's led to slander and division in the church, and it's led to a weakened moral authority on the part of many pastors and thought leaders within the church to them battle evil in the public square. And so Nick asked me to speak on the role of the executive branch in the immigration, but I'm going to tweak it a little bit to be a reflection of these questions from my perch within the executive branch, because I had a front row seat on many of these issues, and importantly, how bad thinking would end up preventing what we were trying to accomplish from less than vigorous political appointees who refuse to occupy the moral high ground, particularly in the first 2 years of the president's administration. But before we get to that, those important days of service, I think it's important to consider the problem that exists within the intellectual community of Christian leaders. And that, thankfully, has been mitigated by the vast majority of people who are actually in the pews. And that is, we are overrun with sentimentalism and a category confusion. A verse like Matthew 25:35, we all know it, "For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in," has become a meta-ethical starting point for compassion that is to a disembodied neighbor above all other considerations such as justice. And we assume that such an unbalanced compassion must extend every role and situation. As much as a father has a much different duty to provide for his family than he does every homeless individual in the city, a Christian in political office and those participating in the political process have much different duties to the political community they either represent or they are participating in. Most churches recognize this basic principle in how they operate their benevolent funds. It's first and foremost for the members of their church. Pastors recognize this when they prioritize pastoral care for those that are actually, they're going to have to give an account for before God, the members of their church. So Matthew 10:16 says, "Behold, I am sending you as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." Perhaps no other verse in the Bible presents the necessary duty of discernment for Christians living in any age, let alone the modern one. It recognizes the world is fallen and that discernment is therefore paramount if we're able to understand, get height, and to understand and wisely respond to the events. So let me give you an example where I think better discernment is needed, to say the least. Ligon Duncan, chancellor of Reformed Theological Seminary, made the misguided argument about legal and immigration perhaps being part of God's plan to re-Christianize the United States during a speech in Atlanta. And he said, I quote, "What if that is God's plan to reverse secularization in the United States? All of us here, because we're Bible-believing Christians, are concerned about a culture that's growing farther away from God, more opposed to the Bible, more opposed to Jesus, more opposed to the gospel. What if immigration is part of God's strategy to reverse that in the United States? And the people that don't look like me, actually, because they believe like me, are much closer to me than people who do like me and who don't believe the Bible and don't believe in Jesus and don't believe in the gospel." End of quote. Can you spot the immediate problem here? So the reality of God's sovereignty and the fact that he directs all things, good and bad, towards his purpose is being used to frame out a disposition that welcomes endless immigration instead of thinking about the effects of political community in which we live. So God used the evil of Joseph's brothers, selling him into slavery, to move him into Egypt so that the region would be prepared for famine. He did not endorse slavery or human trafficking as general rules for his people to then live by. I'm reminded in the early 1990s, Mark Knoll wrote a book that was very wide read in certain circles called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. about the anti-intellectualism that he saw within the church. Now, he was aiming more at the foundations of biblical authority, but if I could appropriate his title, I do think we have a scandal in our Christian thought leader community to failure to think rigorously and critically about what our responsibilities, specifically our responsibilities as Christians, and what is sound public policies in different situations. And that failure leads to a disposition of dispassion towards critical political thinking and, quite frankly, a disdain against those who are trying to do it well. So a Christian can both care for a particular refugee in his neighborhood and also vigorously oppose thousands of refugees coming to their country. A Christian can both adopt a Ukrainian in a war-torn country and at the same time vigorously oppose his country going to fight a war on behalf of that war-torn nation. A Christian can recognize that a sovereign nation are good things and look to apply biblical principles that speak to the importance of assimilation and order in society. A Christian can both restrict immigration and defend the rule of law, while also acknowledging that God will use good policy and bad policy to accomplish his purposes. Duty is ours, results are his. In the immigration debate, this trend has played out by limiting, quite frankly, the space for Christians to question the societal benefits of mass immigration without assimilation, and a vigorous response to illegal immigration without having our morals questioned. You see, the argument goes, if people are made in the image of God and they want to escape a harmful living situation, and some economist says that we need cheap labor because Americans, quote unquote, won't do the job, then you must have an ulterior motive for being opposed to that immigration. You must be a racist. And of course, once that R word gets used, Christian leaders play the politician and fold like cheap suits. Or worse, they then grab a grenade and throw it at the other people that have failed to adopt their viewpoints on the matter. And in the Trump administration, we did an incredible job of shutting down the border against great odds. And the problem is great. It originates from laws that are on the books that act like magnets for illegal immigration. And we got better as the president replaced certain appointees that were unwilling to think creatively and take on the opposition from all those who really are invested in the status quo. But perhaps the best example of controversy, which the left, the media, and what we would call Big Eva collectively lost their mind was the issue of family separation, and where it was perceived that we were just separating children from parents simply as a deterrent. That was the conclusion of the stampede. The situation for policymakers in the executive branch was quite different. It's more complicated. First, illegal immigration is in fact illegal. It's a crime deserving of prosecution. The Department of Justice, defending the rule of law, began to vigorously prosecute every illegal immigrant. But prosecution takes time, which requires detention, unless you're simply going to release individuals into the interior, where there's a proven pattern of disappearing and not showing up for court cases. Our administration then labored under a court case that mandated the release of minors after 20 days. Well, what happens when those minors are with their parents? Well, the decision to defend the rule of law necessitates the separation of power of families. And not unlike when a parent commits a crime and goes to jail, it leads to tragic separation of families. In addition, many of these so-called parents were in fact human traffickers. From every side, we got denounced on this issue from a standpoint of righteous indignation. Charges of immorality. Russell Moore called this a moral atrocity. Franklin Graham even got it. I love Franklin Graham, but he got in on the act and called it a disgrace. Now, we expected it from the left, but to hear it from the pastors and church leaders, many of us who looked up to, was incredibly dispiriting, and I remember it at that time. Because at the end of the day, this was an initiative to solve an enormous problem. Drugs are pouring in. Schools are overcrowded with kids that can't speak English. The cartels have operational control of the border. That means that nothing happens along the border unless they okay it. And they make money not just from the drug trade, but they make $14 million a few years ago, it's probably worse now, from moving people illegally, the human trafficking portion of it. 1 out of every 3 women is abused. The system itself, status quo, separates kids from their families and their parents because one of those statutes that are on the books that act like a magnet actually incentivize the separation of kids because they have beneficial treatment when they come to the border and they are unaccompanied. This is a humanitarian disaster for our country and the individuals in contact with it. None of this is ever acknowledged by those Christians who rush to slander our administration in order to be accepted by the defenders of open borders. So how do we go forward? I think for my part in contributing to that case for restrictionism, I think it has to be built on the foundation of the Bible's recognition, even assumption of nation states. Yoram Hazani's 2018 book, The Virtue of Nationalism, is an indispensable read on this subject. In his book, he explores the biblical foundation for nationalism as far back as the Old Testament. He argues Moses set boundaries for Israel, instructing his people to keep their hands off the lands of neighboring kingdoms like Moab, Edom, and Ammon, which deserved their own independence, citing Deuteronomy 2:5-9. Furthermore, he reminds us that the nation was not based on race. Outsiders could join Israel so long as they accepted Israel's God, laws, and understanding of history. Nationalism is a political philosophy that says independent nation states are the best way to organize governments that both avoid the chaos and insecurity of tribes and clans and preserve freedom and self-determination that globalism and imperialism precludes. Nationalism is not just patriotic love for one's country, but a commitment to prioritize the needs and interests of one's own country over others, not unlike how a parent prioritizes the family or their family over others, or a pastor who prioritizes their church over other. It concerns itself with maintaining the cohesiveness of a particular people and a cultural inheritance, drawn from the past, preserved in the present, and passed on to future generations, on which a state rests, to avoid both dissolution and external attacks. Thus, a Christian immigration ethic that presses for great immigration restrictions does so out of the understanding that the sovereign, distinct nation is a good thing. And not only does the Bible support national sovereignty and borders, but the Bible also has profound principles for thoughtful, limited immigration and emphasizing assimilation. Much of the conversation about how the Bible does this is focused on 2 different words in Hebrew for foreigners. As James Hoffmeyer explains in Wise Welcome, the Hebrew Bible uses different words when referring to foreigners. One word refers to the alien, who is a person who entered Israel with permission and followed legal procedures to obtain recognized standing as a resident alien. In contrast, the foreigner was not a legal resident. Could be an invading enemy, squatter, temporary worker, or merchant, or someone simply passing through. They are not provided the same legal and social protections. These procedures that the alien had to follow to obtain legal standing would have been similar to what we might call a process of assimilation if it worked here in this country today. Learn the language, learn American history, civics, adopting a belief in the universal principles reflected in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Such concepts are rarely a part of the debate by those who hold to the open border position. You never hear it. And anyone who wants to ask these questions, think about the refugee consideration we had with those coming from Afghanistan. You could never ask these questions. So the illegal immigrants who refuse to learn English, instead building communities and subcultures that mirror the home country as the same, that is a problem we face today. Finally, we can derive biblical principles from both the Old and New Testaments that value and uphold the rule of law and instruct governments to prioritize the well-being, safety, and security of their own citizens. The only people for whom it's actually the responsibility. These are in many ways, again, 2 sides of the same coin. A government that does not apply the laws fairly and does not punish the wrongdoer is failing in the most primary God-given responsibility that government has. In the context of immigration, the application could not be clearer. The United States government must enforce the law for the good of the natural-born and naturalized citizens who reside under its authority and protection. Failing to secure the border is a complete abdication of their God-given responsibility. Failing to apply all of the immigration laws fairly and without preferential treatment perverts God's standard of justice, allowing states and cities to declare themselves to be, quote, sanctuaries in violation of federal laws, a violation of God's moral precepts to government, clearly delivered. Thus, securing our borders, punishing illegal immigrants for their unlawful entry and any subsequent criminality, ending sanctuary cities, enacting the mass deportation of illegal immigrants, and ensuring that no tax dollars collected from American citizens go to fund services for illegal immigrants should be top priorities for all Christian-based immigration policies. But I think we need to go further, and I think we need to have a rigorous assessment about whether legal immigration is healthy at where we are right now as a country. The entire country is divided along ideological lines. We're in the midst, quite frankly, of a cold civil war. How does assimilation occur in this environment? The reality is that it doesn't. And in this environment, immigration only increases and exasperates the divisions that we face in the country. Even a compassionate family does not generally adopt a child in the midst of crisis. A church doesn't accept membership for people who don't accord to their statement of faith. A school limits the number of students based on the number of teachers it has. These are the types of prudential questions that statesmen have to begin to ask. This is how they must begin to think. America is in crisis. It's unrecognizable. And both legal and illegal immigration is playing a leading role in that progression. And what the nation needs more than anything, and I'll close on this, is not Christians getting on their uninformed moral high horse, but Christians insistent on being responsible stewards of a blessing that has been God-given to live in this land, this particular land, and to secure the blessings of liberty for this generation and future generations. And that's the work that we gathered to talk about, and that's the work ahead of us. So thank you for your time.